Oh, sorry, you want to start for, I apologize.
Yes, sorry, I'm sorry. It's 4:02, so I think we should
Okay,
start.
sorry.
Hello to everyone who's joining us today, and welcome to the Applied Development Economics Seminar Series hosted by the Lahore School of Economics, International Growth Center and Consortium for Development Policy Research. We are happy to be joined by Dr. Ali Hasanain today. Dr. Hasanain is an associate professor and head of Department of Economics at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. He's also a member of Evidence and Governance and Politics Network and of CDPR. He has previously been a member of Punjab government's Economic Advisory Committee, a Global Leaders Fellow at Oxford and Princeton, and has directed LAM's engagement on World Bank's Pakistan at 100 initiative. His research focuses primarily on how public service delivery can be improved, in particular how technological progress and robust media can underwrite such improvements. Dr. Hasanain, we welcome you to the ADE and we're looking forward to your talk. Before we proceed to your presentation, some house rules, which I'll quickly summarize. These are on the slides in front of our participants today. So Dr. Ali Hasanain will speak for 40 minutes. During this time, you can use the Q&A function to post any questions you have. We'll pause periodically to answer any clarification questions. We will also have a 15-minute designated Q&A session at the end. During this time, you can feel free to add questions on the Q&A function, but also raise your hand and we might then unmute you and allow you to ask your question live. With this, I'll request Dr. Ali to start his presentation whenever you're ready.
Okay, fantastic. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. As I was just saying to the panelists before we started, I think you guys are doing a great public service and really showing the way to the rest of the research community in Pakistan in terms of how to create sort of energy around these discussions, even while we're sheltering in place. It's also a pleasure for me personally to be back in a discussion with CREB, where I had the pleasure of working right out of grad school for a few months. Sort of memorable months that will live on with me. Today I want to talk to you about this the work that I've been doing with the Technology for People initiative at LAMS and specifically with Fareed Zafar for the last 5 years. And out of that work, which is an effort to try to create data analytics streams out of newspapers, doing text analytics on newspapers in Pakistan. One of our first research projects is with Hina Usman, who's a grad student. What we're trying to do here is look at whether it's possible for us to create an automated approach to collecting data on political violence and using an existing data set, the BFRS data set, from before to look at, to also validate this as a broader exercise. So let me just start by sharing my screen. Give me a second, I'm sorry. It was working before we started. So. Sorry. A second. I'm feeling old. I'm showing you something on machine learning and I can't get my slides up.
I discovered to my horror today in class when I shared my screen, there were so many things that I couldn't find my own presentation for a minute or so. So I can fully sympathize with the situation.
Okay, great. Can you see my slides now?
We can see it, yes.
Fantastic. Sorry about that. So what we're trying to do here is look at political violence in Pakistan, as I said. And let's just start by talking about why it's important to understand political violence. First of all, we know that violence is an important contributor to expectations about the economy. So why should economists care about political violence? Well, if you're not going to care for other reasons, then one good reason is that if you have an economy that is beset by a lot of violence, by a lack of surety that you have security of life, property, and contract, you can't take your economy to the next level. But in its own right, of course, the study of political violence is important, especially in a country like Pakistan. And for two reasons. One is that that violence by non-state actors can lead to political consequences of various sorts, and that can have an impact on the political framing of the economy down the line. And of course, it's important as a policy matter for Pakistan to monitor violence, and given the fact that we've had this war on terror and the pushback that the security forces conducted over the last half a decade, we need to monitor how violence is going to assess whether that peace is fragile or firming up. So back in the early part of this decade, Mesquita, Fair, Jordan, Rasul Bash Rais, and Jacob Shapiro at Princeton collectively created this data set by looking at they worked at the LUMS newspaper archives, and they looked at newspapers from January 1988 to November 2011. And in those archives, they looked for specific, they had RAs sitting and reading the entire newspaper and identifying stories that could be categorized as political violence. And they coded information such as location, the target of the attack, the cause, type of violence, and the responsible party. And this, when you collect data from newspaper archives, it has a lot of, you raise concerns about the validity of that data. So the biggest concern is that you're only going to get as much as the journalist got on that day, right? And so these, for different sort of areas, will have different penetration of the media. We know in Pakistan that, and across the world, but specifically in Pakistan, that our newspapers, most of our national level newspapers, only have very limited field teams to collect data. And so if you look at the number of articles that are not from Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, Peshawar, Rawalpindi, Hyderabad, and Quetta, which sort of we call Clipper in our broader project. Outside of Clipper, the number of articles coming in from other parts of Pakistan comprises about maybe 8% or so or less of news reports, right? So we are very, very, and of these, Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, and Rawalpindi make up the vast majority of the reports that are coming in. So when you collect data from newspapers, you have this limitation. On the other hand, one of the values of collecting data from newspapers is that it's convenient, and that you, as long as you know that reporting is reasonably, that your journalism is reasonably robust, it's a pretty quick way to collect a very wide range of data. And again, if you can collect it for a long time period, then that has value of its own, right? And so this sort of a data set is good for looking at differences in, or looking at trends rather than at cross-sectional differences, precisely because the type of reports that we're going to get from rural Sindh, for example, the likelihood that an event in rural Sindh will show up in your newspaper is less than one from Islamabad or from Sahiwal. And certainly the one from Sahiwal is also less likely to be reported than something that happened on Constitution Avenue. But so along with this, so this is the work they've done. For the last 5 years or so, I've been working with Fareed Zafar, who's at our computer science department, and sort of runs so we are both faculty advisors to the Technology for People initiative at LUMS, which is a technology for development lab here. What we've been doing in this time is archiving Pakistani English newspapers in near real time. And so we have 1.6 million articles already archived across 12 sources. Our earliest archive is from 1999, but the first few years, newspapers were not very good at uploading articles. And so our regular archives are from 2002. And these articles are being collected, as I said, in near real time. So the latest one is from today. On this archive, we're conducting analytics at the topic level, which I can talk about later, article and entity, which is the specific individual or organization that's being discussed. And the objective of this project is to create academic data, such as what I'll present today, but also policy tools. So imagine that the data set that I'm going to show you here, there's actually very little legwork that now has to go into creating a dashboard that can report political violence every day, that the police could use or NGOs could use to collect data on the level of violence over time. And of course, because this is and we are collecting the entire newspaper, the number of data sets that we can create out of this is limited only by our imagination, right? So if you can think of something that is consistently going to be reported in the newspaper, we have the tools to extract that from this data set. So in this paper, we use machine learning trained on the BFRS data set, the hand-coded data, and applied to the newsreader corpus to update and extend that data set. So that data set, as you know, as I just mentioned, stopped in 2011. We thought it was of value and we wanted to think of an extension. And so we've extracted more than 33,000 incidents from 2001 through 2019. We again report the same sort of stuff that they did, as well as a prediction probability of each incident. So as with any machine learning algorithm, the machine is only able to guess at whether the data that it is engaging with fits the purpose of the researcher. And so there'll be a probability assigned to each source of data. There are 8 categories of violence. Again, this is very closely tied to BFRS, which includes assassination, attack on the state, and this attack on the state is by another state, attack on law enforcement by non-state actors, riots, terrorism, violence by the state. So if you have police attacking civilians, non-armed combatants, or rather unarmed non-combatants, and then threats of violence and so on. What we are going to do here is actually very different from your typical economics paper. I'm going to show you, first of all, the process that we followed, some of the process that we followed to collect the data, but also then talk a little bit about where we're at so far in terms of validating the data. And I'll show you some trends at the end, but sort of this is not us trying to answer a well-identified question here. So our validation work has multiple steps, and I'll talk more about this, but very briefly, we hand code some data, and we also compare with other data sets to identify the number of false positives and misspecifications that we observe in the data. So let me jump into now talking about how we...
Could I ask a clarification question? So there are some questions on defining political violence, which I believe you've just done. So Kate Wyburny was asking if you're just focusing on non-state actors, but you're saying it's both state. And does that also include international actors? And then the second question on that was, are your results affected by focusing on English language? And what was the rationale for focusing on this language? Is it only because of technical tools?
Okay, fantastic question. So the answer to the first is that when there's an attack on state, as you can see, the second category in this list, any attack on the state is in this data set defined as an attack by another state. So this would include, for example, when the Osama bin Laden raid from 2011, I believe, or the Salala checkpost, those types of attacks, or Indian excursions or Indian shelling, for example, those sorts of attacks will be included in that category, in the attack on state. our primary focus is on non-state combatants attacking the state. Non-state combatants attacking both the state and civilians. So an assassination, for example. And the second question is fantastic. Again, this is, and I noticed Ihsan Kazi, the head of the computer science department here, is in the audience. Maybe later we can have a discussion on this. But when we started, I started this, working on this in 2013. And at the time, and even today, the technical hoops that you have to jump through to get non-English sources are much higher. What I would like to make this eventually be is a data set that includes, as you mentioned, not just Urdu language newspapers, but also regional papers. So the regional Times of Sindh, or think of your specific your papers in specific languages. Translation was a much harder thing to do then than it is now. But as I'll show you later, because there's still some error that comes in with translation even today, the methods that we're using don't give us the most accurate results. They're only, I'll give away my main result, but we only get about 80% accuracy. And my fear today is that if we add Urdu or for example, TV sources or radio and so on, that will further decrease our accuracy today, but it's certainly something that I want to include later. Now, we know for a fact that reporting is very different across Urdu and English, and between regional and national newspapers. There's a large economics literature on the differences between national level and local newspapers. Specifically, local newspapers substitute away from national level issues that they can't compete on with, for example, the New York Times, to focus more on localized information. And this has a sort of increased since communication technology became good enough that those national newspapers were now able to substitute away from local newspapers. But also in terms of language, the issues that are debated in Jung or Nawai Waqt are different from what the type of coverage that you see in English newspapers, and within English newspapers also there's differences. So absolutely a limitation of our work is that we are not yet able to get away from English for technical reasons, but I'd love to get into it over time. Should I proceed? Okay. Yep. So I want to tell you a little bit about what goes on under the behind the scenes. So what we've done is, because BFRS was focused on using the Dawn archives only, it made it easy also for us, because our corpus is also sort of structured around Dawn for two reasons. One, Dawn is, well, three reasons. One, Dawn is almost the newspaper of record of the country. So there's a general belief that it gives you more accurate reporting than other newspapers. Two, Dawn has a very simplified structure of, as I'll show you here, the URLs that you get from Dawn have this number that's highlighted here, and you can index your crawler on this number. So you set the number 1 here, it goes and searches for dawn.com/news-1 first, and then 2 and 3. And this sort of a structure isn't the case with other newspapers, which makes it harder for us to crawl when we're going back. Today, we can go in and if you go to the Tribune today or the News today, crawling the news today for today is easy, even if it's got a different URL structure. But when you're going back, it's harder for technical reasons I probably shouldn't get into right now. And the third reason is that the number of articles that are published in Dawn are among the, I think, roughly tied with the Tribune as the most articles published a day. So now we ran into a problem with, when we said we'll run a crawler and we'll say dawn.com/123. The problem was that the index, this is a graph of the publication date on the x-axis and the index values on the y-axis. And you can see that although it's mostly linear, that there are some important and frustrating for us deviations away. So it's not that every day they add one to the last ID that they published and just publish that. It's not even that they just skip a few, which would also be, if it was monotonically increasing and you had some skips, that would be usable. They have this weird thing where there are some IDs that are more advanced that were published before. And anyway, so this is just to describe how crawling was not as simple. When we started this project, I thought, we'll go in, set a crawler, and 5 days later, we'll have all of the newspaper archives to work with. It wasn't quite that way. And it's taken a lot of time for us to work on. I'll show you other things in a bit. So one thing about, again, with incident reporting is that Dawn has a very clear structure on where the first sentence is typically very explanatory of what the project, of what the article is going to be about. This follows the sort of reverse pyramid model that journalists typically use. We then sort of narrowed 1 million articles, or at that time it was 1 million when we started. Now it's 1.6. 1 million articles narrowed down to 200,000 that we needed to look at. We used a topic modeling algorithm to select articles that we wanted to keep. So topic modeling will basically give us, as you can see here, examples of what that means is we used the topics of injuries and casualties, violence in the world, and terrorism. Our underlying code has the ability to restrict articles by, or to predict what topics apply to a certain article. Multiple topics can apply to the same articles. For example, terrorism and injuries and casualty will often co-occur. But this allows us, so by removing, for example, the topic of economy or the weather or climate change, that gets us obviously a short list of articles to work with. We narrow articles further by geotagging. So every article will have, as you saw here, Karachi, and sometimes those articles, it's hard to extract one location because multiple places might be discussed. But we can extract certainly places that don't mention a Pakistani location when we're working with this. So now this is sort of stuff that perhaps outside my comfort level, but let's go through this. So to extract relevant information, first the event date is determined, and we do this by looking at whether it occurs in the main passage, ideally, or through the published date. We use the published date secondarily only because sometimes articles are republished after minor edits. Then a stochastic gradient descent classifier is trained on the BFRS dataset, the original hand-coded dataset. We train this thing on our existing data to understand how to predict an event type. So it looks at the data that in our repository and compares with how that article was coded by hand, and then it figures out how to do this in the future. We use only about, blanking on the exact fraction, but we use a fraction of our BFRS dataset to begin with, because you always want to, when you're doing machine learning, you always want to keep out of sample data that you can then test on. So we used part of our hand-coded data to train on, and then validated it against the other part of the data that was, for us, the gold standard, in that it was carefully vetted by human researchers. I've already spoken about the 8 event types, and we observe a 79.7% accuracy in predicting event type. Now, in the article is more information that we need, and to ascertain the count of injuries and deaths, we used parts of speech parse trees to identify numbers and syntax. So what this means is, so we use this, think of this as a tree of what information is contained within a superset of information, if you will. And so when we wanted to look at least 6, this example, where the sentence says at least 6 people were killed and 14 wounded on Friday when a suicide bomber attacked a wedding ceremony in eastern Afghanistan. An official told AFP, there's a lot of information embedded here. How many people were killed, how many were wounded, what day, how and by whom, and so on. And so the evidence, the data, that the quality of the algorithm isn't really up to our satisfaction yet. And we're going to move to something that we felt might not have worked very well the first time, which is why we skipped it, which used to use semantic role labeling using Berkeley's FrameNet. And if you look at this example here, so the frame says that this is the frame for violence, right? So the structure of a violence story will be that the act may involve an aggressor or cause, injuring a victim, or aggressors causing each other harm. And there are some examples here of the sentence and the tagging of parts of the sentence with sort of to extract the relevant content from it. Okay, but this is something that this is very much work in progress. I'm going to skip this and just point out also again, one of the problems with working with this sort of crawl data is we set our crawler to crawl from 1 to as high as we could get the crawler ID today. I'm sorry, the URL ID today. And when we got this data early on, the number of incidents and the number of people killed and injured that we were finding were multiples of the BFRS data. And so it turned out that there were a few reasons for this. So we had to go back. Let me put it this way. So there are two things when you look at this. One is because the hand-coded BFRS used physical newspapers, they were only going to use particular editions of the Dawn, so the Karachi edition or the Lahore edition. And these are subsets of the data that's now put on Dawn.com. There are also other stories that are on Dawn.com that don't make it to newspapers for good reasons, like what Fawad Khan ate today. But that's not relevant to us. So we ended up making some changes and deduplicating, and we found that the number of articles that we had to work with plummeted and became more accurate over time. So before I move on, keep in mind that any algorithm that predicts, that tries to extract data of this sort will have a probability of accuracy. The algorithm itself will tell us that I'm assigning this story the topic violence with a probability of 20%, let's say. And as you can see here, most articles that we have, the probability assigned is actually less than half. That's just something that we have to work with in this space, far cry from where we'd like it to be. So now I'm going to move to telling, first of all, just very quickly about geographic coverage, and I will both be explaining the data and also comparing against, sort of starting the validation exercise. So first of all, as you can see here, we are getting incidents from most places, but also as you can see, there are specific areas where we are not getting data. And again, I'll speak more about this in a second. Well, right here. If you look at BFRS data on the right and our data on the left for the same time period, so we're restricting ourselves to their time frame, you can see that first of all, the first thing that you'll notice is that the number of incidents that you see, there are many districts in which BFRS is reporting incidents, but the automated data is not. And so that again goes back to this problem of the Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, Peshawar, Rawalpindi bias in English newspapers. But the second thing that you see is that the number of incidents, the number of casualties being reported in Karachi, for example, is far higher in our data than in BFRS. In Quetta is far higher in our data than in BFRS. In Lahore and Peshawar and other places, Faisalabad, I believe, is far higher than in other places. And I think the reason that this is happening is that the casualty happened in, let's say, the Chagi district and was reported in Quetta, or happened in another district of, let's say, Sujawal. I don't know the districts of Sindh very well. In the BFRS data, it was well coded in the BFRS data, but the report was started with Karachi. There was a conference that said that there was a newspaper report that, or the police reported that an attack happened in this nearby district, right? And so, because Karachi appears as the location of where the report was happening, our system is picking that up rather than picking up where the event happened, and it's very hard for the machine to tell the difference between these things. I'll skip this, and again, if you look at a comparison in specifically, this is Balochistan, a comparison of our automated data on the top with BFRS at the bottom. What you see is that our automated data has many more reports coming from Quetta, which is this top trend, than BFRS does, right? And you see more reports from these other districts of Balochistan in the BFRS data than in our data. And so we're actively working to figure out how to fix this problem. But if you sort of zoom out a bit and look at the data from the provinces overall, there's a bit of over-reporting, or not over-reporting, but there's more incidents being reported in our data in Punjab and Sindh, a bit in KPK, and significantly less in FATA. But for the most part, the automated system has tracked fairly well the BFRS hand-coded data in terms of accuracy. Now, that was a comparison with the hand-coded data that we are using, that we are applying the same methods as, and we are trying to mimic. And so, looking at that, and again, as I told you, BFRS was coded using a specific regional report, and so our data is very likely to be more detailed than BFRS. But we want to track that fairly well. But BFRS itself differs from other data sets, which also try to look at violence and conflict. So a few of these, ACLED looks at is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, and GTDB. These data sets typically, GTDT and SATB especially, focus specifically on terrorism, and they use different methodologies, and so it not sort of comparing well with them is partially going to be because of methodological differences, and potentially partially because of any weaknesses that we have in our code. So seeing variations from these data sets is not in and of itself indicative of a poor quality on the part of our algorithm. But for the sake of comparison, the black line or total incidents is our data, and we've matched it to the years in which each data set was collected. So BFRS, as you can see, goes from 2003 to 2011. And looking at this, I'm only really worried about 2008. We're still trying to investigate what happened there. But for the most part, we're tracking BFRS quite well in our data. And then BFRS stopped in 2011. But if you look at ACLED, I'm pretty happy to note that our data tracks it pretty well after we've given up the crutch of BFRS. So having already trained on BFRS, we're tracking another data set fairly well. Again, this isn't definitive proof that we're accurate, because as I said, we follow different methodologies, but it's reasonable, and it seems to us to be reasonable. GTD and SATP were collected for longer, but again, some of these, as I said, focused more on terrorism. In fact, both of them focused on terrorism restrictively. And so you see that in many years, our data reports more incidents of violence than they do. Broadly speaking, though, the great news, as I'm sure you know from personal experience, is that really 2015 or 2014 was a watershed moment for the security of the country in the medium term, and we've seen consistent decrease in violence since. Here we're just doing the same thing with a different cut. We're taking The blue line here is the mean of other databases, and we're looking at the minimums and maximums of those databases. So that's the band in which other data sets, these other data sets that we're comparing with, lie for a given year, and the red is ours. So again, we're tracking reasonably, I'd say reasonably well. Now, to look at data quality, we validate a sample of incidents. We look at 16,000 incidents. Well, I'll skip this part, but from for particular years and 30% for other years. And we asked, did the incident involve political violence? Did the algorithm identify the correct event type? And were there discrepancies in the number of individuals reported injured or killed? So we had people hand code, go back. So our crawler had got the first paragraph of each article listed for our RAs, who sat down and looked at it to figure out whether, along with the result from our data, and were able to say, read it and then say, did the algorithm correctly identify whether it was in fact political violence, whether the type of event was correctly reported, and whether the numbers of people injured or killed was correct. This allows us to look at false positives. So incidents, for example, a road car accident, which is reported as political violence, as well as misspecifications in our data. This is really fresh work, but so far we are seeing very little false positives reported in political violence, more false positives being reported in non-political violence. So again, road car accidents, for example, might be getting included. And then misspecifications are far less in non-political violence, but greater in political violence. So an assassination, for example, being categorized as a riot or vice versa, which is probably more likely. Our data compares reasonably well with BFRS in terms of extracting the number of people injured or killed. The differences are mostly the modal value is a zero difference in the number of injured and killed, happily. But we do see a slightly more permissive sort of algorithm than the hand-coded work. So we're reporting more injured and more killed by a bit than BFRS. And this is true for the centered around 0-bit, at least is true in all of the places that we're looking at this. So finally, I'm going to just talk a little bit about what it is that we saw in the data. And again, as I described earlier, incidents of political violence have fallen. I'm quite comfortable in saying that our data fairly well represents reality, although I should note that one thing again with newspapers is that censorship really kills accuracy. So for example, during the operations in FATA, when entire villages were wiped out, that data didn't come through because there was a media blackout.
There's just about 5 minutes left.
I will finish earlier than that. In terms of the numbers injured and killed, we see some spikes in a couple of years. These might be because of operations. We haven't gone in and looked at very carefully what comprises these spikes. But again, they track fairly well what others are reporting, so we're reasonably happy with them. Well, okay, that's right here, right? So one spike, at least in 2014, was because of an increase in political assassinations, and you can see other the breakdown of the data otherwise. So don't have a conclusion slide, but let me actually go back right to the start to wrap up. I think what we're trying to do in this paper is really let me stop here. What we're trying to do in this paper is to look at, we have two, I suppose, objectives here. The narrow objective is to try and see if we can't create a much cheaper, much more replicable technology to keep political violence data being extracted over the long term and create a data set that stands in accuracy on its own right. And I'm reasonably confident that we've done a decent job in contributing there. Again, before we, in the next few months, what we want to do is play around with some algorithms, also play around with trying to do other heuristics. And heuristics means sort of doing simple code that we plug in there that doesn't sort of travel well to other contexts, but allows us to clean up some of our results. And then continue to think of ways to validate. And perhaps this audience would be good to discuss ways in which you think we might do different cuts to validate the quality of the data. I'd love to hear any feedback and advice you have on that. But more broadly, I think that the data set, the broader project itself is now sort of starting to come of age. It's been something that Fareed and I have been working on for 5 years, very slowly. Typically with Fareed's RAs, so stealing Fareed's RA's time from either other projects or their own leisure time. And we're now at a stage where I think we're quite happy, first of all, with the scale of the data that we now have, 1.6 million articles. This is nowhere near the largest data sets of this nature worldwide. Media Cloud is the Harvard and MIT project that scrapes newspapers from around the world. It's at more than 1 billion newspaper articles. But the value of, I think, what we're doing here over and above what Media Cloud, for example, does, is that we're able to do a much more, we're able to explore far more our own context. And so I'm looking for collaborators to do two things. One is academic collaborators whose interest is, for example, if you come to me and say, I want to know when a bureaucrat gets transferred. That's something that we've kicked around with a colleague here about whether it's valuable, because when someone is transferred, that a prominent bureaucrat is transferred, that gets reported in the newspaper, and we can create a whole history of bureaucratic transfers over time, perhaps through a similar effort as this. Or we could go and look at whether a firm is mentioned in newspapers and how that compares with the stock market, the market valuation of the firm. Really, if it gets reported in the newspaper and you have an idea, come speak to me or Fareed, and we'd love to sort of take the fixed cost that we have and work with a wider set of collaborators. For most of this project, the data analysis on this project and the project management was done by Hina, but it was building on this fixed cost, fixed effort that Fareed and I had already incurred, and we'd love to create more academic collaborations. Secondly, I think we're also looking to create interesting data dashboards and policy tools for that might create value for public debate and for NGOs. And thirdly, if you're a computer scientist and you have ideas about how to improve accuracy and get in on working on this, please let us know. So with that, thank you very much, and let's take questions.
Thank you, Ali. This was absolutely fascinating. So this is the first time I've looked at this technique, and I think there are a number of questions. Some of them are anonymous, and so I will be asking them on our behalf, on their behalf. And so I'll try to group a couple of questions. There are a few questions on labeling. So were the labels machine labeled or human labeled? And then, so Faizur Rahman is asking, do you include violence like tribal clashes in FATA? And what about clashes between two religious sects like Sunni and Shia? And similarly, there's an anonymous comment that is asking about how different policies and campaigns such as polio vaccination and how this would actually show up in your data as well. And then I'll ask the rest later.
Those are great questions. And honestly, some of this is stuff that I haven't really done a deep dive into. So the labeling, as I showed you, let me see if I can find the right slide for that. Okay, so we have extracted the text of the entire article, and we use these different processing techniques to first extract the number of entities. So we have a very nice entity classifier, which very accurately will tell you, here's a person. And they look for the instances in which the same person is mentioned across our archives, and we can look at, we can tag articles to that person. We can, and this creates problems because, for example, my name gets misspelled more often than it gets correctly spelled. If I'm incorrectly spelled, then you have to have a disambiguation link in your processing chain that figures out that when you mention Ali Hasanain, it's the same person as Sayyid Ali Hasanain, for example. Or when you're talking about Amir Khan, you're talking about the boxer or the actor, right? So we label entities and locations that way. In terms of labeling an article as whether it falls into, let's say, assassinations or riots, those are things that we will bank on our classifier, which is again using machine learning, by showing it enough articles that are assassination articles, the machine is able to on its own learn to label similar articles down the line as being assassination articles. So that's the second part of how we do this labeling. We haven't looked at at either sectarian violence or polio vaccinations, sort of violence around polio vaccinations yet. That's an interesting cut that we can do to the data. So I think the geographic cut on that would be interesting. So look at the geographic mapping and see the incidence of various different types of events. But again, if you think about it, when you're looking at the country as a whole, there are all sorts of ways in which violence occurs. And the number of ways in which, the number of interesting subcategories is probably quite large. If other people have ideas, we'd absolutely love to hear from you. And it's something that we can perhaps build on as we go down the line. Maybe it might be useful for this paper. So thank you for that. More questions?
Thank you. So I think, yes, at the end, you've just answered another one of the questions, which is basically how do you code the severity and intensity of an incident? Some more anonymous questions. So again, I'll group them. So there's one question on any particular reason for selecting 2009 to 2019, and whether you thought about looking at international platforms or international newspapers. And then another question is whether you trained the data on entire corpus or just the corpus containing political violence news only. I think that's kind of technical for me to understand, but maybe you can answer that as well. Yeah, and then I'll get to the next group afterwards.
Okay. So I think severity, I didn't really completely explain, but severity is just looking at numbers killed and injured. We can't tell you how badly injured people were. So in some sense, we can't get at the full severity of an attack. We're also not coding material violence. Violence that, what was the model town guy who beat up cars? You know what I'm talking about. So anyway, right?
Gulu Bhatt, I think.
Yes, Gulu Bhatt, of course. So we can't, if he injured people, that'll get tracked. But if he injured cars, it won't. So the question around 2009 to 19, why did we do this? Really, we're doing this because BFRS already existed from, as I said, 1988 to 2011. And I saw value in that data set. I wanted to see that data set be updated and live on. And so 2019 is just because the last time we updated the data before we started working on it was a few months ago. And it should really come to 2020 now. And we will, of course, update it down the line. So 2009 isn't the start of when we're doing let me show you. So our data runs from 2002 to 2019. And I think what you're talking about might be, you might have seen something here, perhaps 2010 or 2009 here. This is just, the full data is 2002 to today. And the cuts that we do here are to match, are only fractions of our data to match the other data set, which was more time limited than us. Why didn't we look at the international newspapers? I think simply because scraping and keeping archives is very costly in computing time, and so it's costly full stop. And we wanted to restrict our attention to, well, you know, we had opportunity cost of spending money there. We had to allocate scarce resources, and so we chose to do something that was more focused on Pakistan. One thing that might be interesting is to look at how reporting differs about Pakistan in the international press versus local press, and that's worth looking at. Can you repeat the question around the purpose?
So whether it was just focusing on political violence news only, or the entire corpus, if this is maybe perhaps a clarification question more than anything else. This is for the probability model.
I see. So the probability model is applied to the whole corpus. So if there's an event that, if there's an article that mentions the stock market, there'll be a probability assigned to there'll be a probability number assigned, or a likelihood assigned to the probability that that article is in fact about the topic that we've identified, right? So we don't just say this is for sure an article about the stock market. We say there's a 30% chance that this is about the stock market. I hope that clears it.
Then we have a question by Javed Yunus. Javed, you're unmuted. Please, can you ask your question live?
Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First, I would like to congratulate Ali and other authors of this data. You are doing a great job. Actually, it's a very laborious and tedious job that you're doing for the last five years or so. I just wonder that given that, a political violence can be underreported or overreported in the newspaper. One, because it can be driven by the perception of the reporter that is reporting that event, right? And then it is likely that an event can be missed, right, from the eyes of the reporter. I wonder if you could, consult a police office in each district or maybe headquarters in each province, and can get the record from police, if that is something in your mind.
Okay, great question. So first of all, it's only tedious if you're not enjoying it, and this is a labor of love for me. In terms of political violence, as I said earlier, and as you've correctly said, this data might be underreporting. I don't see why it should be over-reporting unless we're misspecifying. So the only way to over-report is that we're counting a road accident as a political attack. But I don't see in the newspaper over-reporting of violence likely to have happened unless it's completely false reporting that's happening.
No, Ali, I think what can happen is this, that let's say a reporter reports an incident as the political violence, right? But maybe after a day or two or a week or something, then, it really has to be corrected, because that actual incident that it was reported as political violence was a crime, right?
Sure. I understand. So yes.
Yeah.
To that extent, you're right. We might be misspecifying, or you're saying, in fact, that there might be inaccuracies in reporting, false sort of claims of political violence. And that's true. I think in the aggregate, I'm not very worried about it for a few reasons. The biggest one is that, so first of all, I don't think it's going to be my prior is that it's not going to be a big thing. But more importantly, it's not likely to vary very much across place and time. So if it is a problem, it should hopefully be an error term that we can assume is reasonably close to constant. But in terms of underreporting, absolutely. I also talked about media blackouts, and as you said, the people they just might miss articles, and this is always going to be a limitation of any data that you get out of newspapers. That's the first thing I think I said, but always I should say, when you're collecting data from newspapers, you are limited to the accuracy of the newspaper. You had another point about
police records.
Yes, fantastic. So with police, again, I would expect both underreporting and overreporting. There will be events that happen that aren't reported in the newspaper but are lodged as an FIR. And as I found out in my own case, I had, it was not a violence case, thankfully, but I had a theft in my village on my farm, and I went to myself to get the FIR sort of written out, and they refused. They refused because in Pakistan, one of the big sins of the bureaucracy is that we couple bureaucratic incentives, that is the SHO getting promoted in life, with reporting about problems, which is that an FIR is just report that something happened. It doesn't say that the SHO did a good or bad job in reducing crime in his area of work or the beat. Yeah. But effectively, if you have more FIRs coming from one place, senior bureaucrats across departments, not just police, but other places also, almost invariably will punish subordinates who were at the helm when such spikes and bad outcomes happened. So there is significant underreporting in police data also. I'm doing this police reforms project with Ali Shima, Jake Shapiro, who's one of the authors of BFRS, and Ehsan Farooqi over at Ideas. And one thing that we're interested in looking at is, in fact, going through our, we have the FIR data for Sheikhupura district. And so going through the FIR data there and comparing against our data is just hopefully the next project that we end up doing. It's something I'd like to do. We haven't I want to finish this before I start that, but it's absolutely something I want to do.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. We have one question. Well, we have a couple of questions by Kate Viberny. Kate, if you could just maybe summarize too.
Yeah, it's super exciting, really interesting project. I just had a couple of follow-up thoughts about the bias in coverage. So one, I don't know how people have dealt with this in the literature with the existing data sets, but it seems like there might be a lot of interdependence over space in the coverage errors because of limited media resources. So if you think about a newspaper like Dawn, if something big happens in Lahore, then they're less likely to cover an event in Bahawalpur that happens on the same date because they have only so many journalists or only so many inches of column space. So I don't know how seems like something that may come up in some of the types of analyses you would do with this. And then maybe a more constructive thought about this. I think if you do end up extending this to looking at multiple newspapers or multiple sources, like regional and national ones, it would be really interesting to directly analyze the bias in terms of coverage. Because if you identify an event that's captured only in a regional paper but not in a national paper, then you could, I mean, that gap in coverage seems like a really important outcome variable. Which kinds of events get missed out on the national stage, in what situations and why? That seems important in its own right politically. So I think that's obviously a long-term thought, since that's the future stage of the data collection, but I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah, so fantastic, Kate, thank you. So on the first, there are two ways in which an event in Lahore, for example, might reduce reporting about Bahawalpur. And it's both on in some sense, the production and the consumption of reporting by the newspaper itself. The first is, if you have a finite number of editors, if you have a finite number of journalists, and there are multiple events happening within the journalist beat, then there will be some allocation of resources where you'll end up, if your media van, the satellite van, is going to one area, it's not going to another area. This, you would hope, might be mitigated by having multiple sources, which we will probably not in this project, but over time hope to build in. But it is a problem. And there the concern would be to what extent is there herd behavior in what you're reporting on, and to what extent are you looking for creating your own distinct reporting, because there is interdependence there. And the other way in which it matters is through what we call news pressure. There's a very nice paper, one of my favorite papers, don't know if anyone from my media class is here, but my favorite paper in the media class that I teach is this paper on reporting on Israeli attacks on Palestine. And they demonstrate that there are more attacks on Palestine that will get Israel discredited in the international press on days that there are scheduled football matches. Because Israel knows that the day that there's a football match, there's a big football match, the world is going to be watching the match, and we're going to get pushed down in terms of column space. My question about this, I frame this slightly differently. I asked the question what the newspaper would have looked like on September 12th, 2001, if 9/11 hadn't happened. In that counterfactual world, we would have had a newspaper in a headline that had nothing to do with 9/11, which eventually got pushed onto maybe page 3. And the story from page 3 got pushed to page 5, and the story from page 5 got dropped altogether. And so, yes, that's absolutely a thing, and would love to work on this. In terms of looking at multiple sources, that's another thing that I wanted to do and would be on my list of projects to do in this space, except that I haven't yet found good archives of regional newspapers. And again, if anyone has resources on this, digitized archives of regional newspapers in Pakistan, I'd love to hear more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. I know we're taking a lot of your time, but if you have a couple of more minutes, we have more questions.
I have one line.
All right. So there's one question by Dr. Navid Hamid. Sir, if you can just unmute and ask.
Ali, thank you very much. This was a very fascinating and interesting presentation. I'd heard about this, but first time I've really seen the depth and the extent of it. It's a very ambitious project, and really congratulations to you for even thinking about it and then bringing it to this state. My questions really are going to be about along usability of this data set for research. And so I'll ask 3 or 4 of those, and then you can answer whichever you like on, as you choose. First, it was that you have got this data, violence, a geotag. So what is the lowest level? Does it go down to the village level, union council, town, tehsil? What is that thing? That's number 1. 2, how much flexibility is there? Or let me ask, accessibility to outside researchers. If somebody is doing some work on the impact of political violence or violence on academic outcomes or something, then outside researchers, what kind of policy do you have with regard to access to those researchers for the information about violence? Third is, of course, flexibility. So as just somebody mentioned about polio, and another one that occurred to me was religious minorities or whatever. Is it possible to put in new keywords, specific keywords for a particular researcher's interest, and then rerun this thing with that it added, that if you don't have it already in there? So these are some of the questions I had, and I'd love to hear what you think about these things.
So thank you, sir. First of all, I don't know if I said this. I had meant to say it, but now that you've spoken, I should have said it. This was IGC funded, so thank you for that. Well, so at least this part of it was, a lot of it was just bootstrapped, and we did it. We did the good chunk of the code ourselves, but this particular project is IGC funded. In terms of usability for research, we used a shapefile with that had locations down to the lowest level of granularity that we could get was at the village level, I believe. I would like to go deeper and be able to say Mall Road or Jail Road and so on, or even lower. So now with Google Maps, if you can get Google Map location data, you can say my house has a right is on some shapefile that Google maintains somewhere. I'd love to be able to do that, because sometimes it'll help with location disambiguity. There are many Islamabads in Pakistan, right? And there are lots of places. I think it's something like 200, 300 places that occur multiple times in the data. And there are also places that get spelled differently again in our data. But the short of it is we're using village level data. We're using a village level data shapefile, and we'd love to keep improving it. Accessibility for outside researchers, I think, to be perfectly honest right now, I'm looking for collaborators who can take, again, as I said earlier, the fixed cost that we've already incurred for the last 5 years, and it's been a good chunk of our time and effort. And what I'd love to see is 10 people step forward and say, here's what we need from you in exchange for a co-authorship arrangement. And so, we want to see for a certain phase right now, maybe a year, 2 years, we'd like to see some some output for ourselves with this. But what we are working on next actually is a portal, and whether we gate it or not is a decision that hasn't been taken yet, but is a portal that will allow people to create queries of this sort on your own and get your own data sets as output. And so we put this in the public. That's the hope, and this is actively under development. We're actually we coded it up, and some of you might have seen it before, and we've thrown out the first iteration of the code, even though it worked pretty well, but we want to polish it up further. And so that portal is under development at the moment. In terms of flexibility, absolutely. So there are 2 levels at which you can create flexibility. The first is, if all you want to do is get the corpus of articles that mention Navid Hamid, then you can go into our portal and you can search for that, and we can give you the data set of that. But what if you want to get to a deeper level of analysis, such as what we did here, and you want to extract not articles, but you want to extract you sort of higher level concepts such as violence. There, I think at the moment we're not at the level of being able to create like a portal, but it would require, I imagine, maybe 2 months or 3 months at most of a dedicated RA's time or dedicated coder's time to create very good data, and we'd get the first results to you in a matter of days actually. So this data, the core of this data was created. You'll remember that actually the grant, there was something going on at the IGC that caused the grant to come slower. We were actually done with the first cut on the data by the time the grant came through. But it does take sort of all of these iterations to look for inaccuracies. I would love to be able to do this again a few times and then figure out the answer to your question. But eventually the hope is that we want to be able to do this at the click of a button. So you should be able to go into the entire corpus, ask your limited questions, and get the data output. And that's the hope absolutely for the future.
Thank you. That's very good to hear. And I think Hamna had a similar question about whether this could be used eventually to track violence against women. And I think that could be a possibility. So just again, we're over time, but I think these are good questions. These are technical questions. Some of them have been asked by graduate students at the Lahore School. So perhaps just on the technical side is how this method would maybe control for or correct for the fact that there might be some areas that are underreported in the news itself. So Raja Abdul Rahman from LSE is asking that there might be an incident that is less likely to be reported if it's in Badin versus if it's in Karachi, and how would the method actually maybe control for that? And related to that, someone is asking, this is an anonymous comment, on whether this would take care of the proportion of political violence news to the total news, total perhaps economic news and all of that. If as a proportion that changes, does your method also incorporate that somehow, that it's relatively a peaceful time, or is that something that's not possible in this method?
Okay, fantastic. Again, I'm happy to take as many questions as you guys want to ask, unless there's a limitation on your end. In terms of asking or correcting for the lack of prevalence, I think there are things that researchers could do. And if what I wanted to do here was to continue working on political violence in depth, here are some of the things that I might want to do. The first is that you want to build a secondary data set that looks at the number of news reporters in different places. So that's one thing you could do. That has the problem that, or limitation that you would only get that data because that data doesn't exist. You'd have to go and manually collect it. You'd get a snapshot today, but you won't really get good data going back. Another thing that you could do is look at all, you could look at number of stories coming out of Badin in total and look at political violence as a percentage of that. And maybe there's a correction that you could apply by figuring out like a propensity of news reporting from a particular place. So the less reported a place is, the less you would believe violence data coming from that place because you'd expect some misreporting. Another thing that you could do would be that you could, another thing that you could do is you could go into collecting other data sets such as administrative data, such as FIR data from around the country if you could manage, which will be very, very hard. Like it took us years of pleading and groveling before we got FIR data for 3 districts. And that was Ali Chima and I leveraging sort of good contacts in the police, and it was, at the IG level, and it was just tough. So, but if you could get this data at the national level, then maybe there's a corrective that you could apply there. Your other question, again, so yes, we can absolutely look at political violence as a percentage. That's something that's going into our dashboard for future use. You can select a topic and see what percentage of total reporting that comprises. There was another question, I think. Farah, did you have another question?
No, so I think you've answered both of them. The last question was actually about if this data could be used to look at correlations between economic factors and political violence. Okay.
Yes. So again, I think I saw inflation there somewhere in the question, yes. And absolutely. So could you repeat that question? I just want to make sure I'm answering the specific question, not something generally about inflation.
Sure. So let me just open that question up so that I also ask you the exact question.
While looking for it, what's the deal with asking anonymous questions? I mean, these are not sensitive questions, right?
Yeah, these are not sensitive questions, but I think you can choose to ask anonymously. So he's basically asking, he or she, has any correlation been tested for political violence news versus economic indicators such as inflation, unemployment, growth rate, etc. over time?
Sorry, could you repeat that one more time for me?
Correlation between political violence news versus economic indicators such as inflation.
Got it. Yeah, okay. Got it. So, sorry, that's a great question. Again, this particular study was not about exploring correlates with political violence and the causes of political violence. It was more looking at whether we can collect data on political violence. But that's a fantastic, we had this orientation plan for undergraduates, and I was thinking of the famous paper that looks at how there were more witches hunted during famine years in the Dark Ages in Europe than in years without famines. And so absolutely these things would matter to political violence. You'd also expect them to matter perhaps more, and there are other people who can speak to this better than I can, to domestic violence. Right, so it's actually quite common for women to get beaten up more during recessions, unfortunately, and when people lose jobs. So those are things to look at, and on that topic, we do want to extend this to looking at gender violence. But again, because as you can see, there's so many things that you can do with this data. I can't go and push the agenda individually, and I'll repeat at the risk of sounding redundant, that we are looking for collaborators. You can leverage what we've done, and we're happy to enter into those sort of co-authorship relationships. And not just in econ, we're happy to work with people working in other disciplines.
Thank you so much, Ali. I think this is an absolute fantastic public good, and so happy to know that you're looking for collaborators. I'm sure after this, you might be getting many emails to that effect. I know a lot of people have dropped out by now. I mean, we went 17 minutes over time, but these questions will be online. And so I thank you again for your time and for presenting this.